There is a number that tells the entire story of American ambition. That number is 10 million. 10 million patents granted by the United States Patent and Trademark Office since the year 1790. 10 million individual moments when a person sat down, put their idea on paper, described it in careful detail, and asked their government to protect it. 10 million times that the machinery of a republic, built on the belief that ideas have value, said, yes, this idea belongs to you, and here is the document to prove it. The 10 millionth patent was granted in June of 2018. The patent holder was an inventor who had developed a new type of coherent laser technology. There was a small ceremony, there were some photographs. A few technology journalists wrote brief articles noting the milestone. And then the world went on, as it always does, without pausing very long to consider what 10 million of anything actually means. But we are going to pause. We are going to stay here for a while, because the history of the United States Patent Office is not simply the history of American invention, it is the history of American thought, of how a nation decided from its very first days as a nation that the life of the mind had economic value, that the products of human creativity deserved the same legal protection as a piece of land or a sum of money, and that a government which protected those products would produce more of them than a government which did not. That decision, made quietly and with relatively little fanfare in the spring of 1790, set in motion a process that shaped everything that came after. Before we go further, if you find yourself drifting into sleep as you listen to this, that is exactly what this channel is for. Slow history, told at the pace that understanding requires, designed to carry you somewhere quiet. If this kind of content is what you come here for, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel. It costs you nothing, and it helps this channel reach more people who are looking for exactly this. And while you're at it, a like on this video tells the algorithm that this is worth sharing, which is the only way a channel like this finds the people who need it. Now, back to 1790. The Constitution of the United States, ratified in 1788, contained a clause that most people have never read and fewer have thought about carefully. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8. The Congress shall have power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. That is the entire text, 43 words, and in those 43 words, the founders of the United States did something that was, in the context of world history, genuinely unusual. They put intellectual property in the Constitution itself, not in a law that Congress could pass and repeal, not in a regulation that an executive agency could write and revise, in the foundational document of the Republic, in the text that defined what kind of country this was going to be. Why did they do that? The men who wrote the Constitution were students of history. They had read widely in the political philosophy of their time and in the historical record of the civilizations that had come before them. And what the historical record told them with uncomfortable clarity was that nations that did not protect intellectual property did not produce much of it. England had established its first patent system in 1624 with the Statute of Monopolies. The Venetian Republic had operated a form of patent protection for inventors as early as 1474. The pattern was consistent across different times and different cultures. Where inventors could be confident that their inventions would be protected, they invested the time and labor and money that invention requires. Where no such protection existed, they kept their methods secret, or they did not bother to invent at all. The founders wanted a country that invented things, and so they put the legal foundation for that country directly in the Constitution before they had done almost anything else.
The Patent Act of 1790 was the first legislation passed under the new Constitution that actually created a functioning patent system. It was signed by George Washington on April 10, 1790, which means that the United States government, which had been in operation for less than a year, had already decided that protecting inventors was among its most urgent priorities. The original system was, by modern standards, remarkably small and personal. Applications for patents were reviewed not by a dedicated agency, but a three-person board consisting of the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, and the Attorney General. Any two of the three had to approve an application before a patent could be granted. Think about that for a moment. Thomas Jefferson, who was serving as Secretary of State, personally reviewed patent applications in the early years of the Republic. He read the descriptions of inventions. He examined the drawings. He made judgments about whether the devices described were genuinely new and genuinely useful. Jefferson took this responsibility seriously, more seriously, arguably, than the drafters of the original legislation had intended. He wrote extensive notes on the applications he reviewed. He corresponded with inventors about the details of their submissions. He visited workshops to examine physical models of devices he found interesting or unclear.
He was, in effect, the first patent examiner in American history, and he brought to that role the curiosity and rigor that he brought to everything else. In the first year of the patent system's operation, 3 patents were granted. 3! In the entire year of 1790, the United States government examined applications and found exactly 3 inventions worthy of protection. The first patent ever granted under the American system went to a man named Samuel Hopkins of Vermont for an improvement in the making of potash and pearl ash. Potash is a chemical compound derived from wood ash used in the production of glass and soap and fertilizer. The improvement that Hopkins had developed allowed potash to be produced more efficiently, which was a genuinely useful thing in an economy that depended heavily on these materials. The patent document that Hopkins received was signed by George Washington, by Thomas Jefferson, and by Edmund Randolph, who was serving as Attorney General. It is the only patent document in American history to bear 3 signatures of that particular historical weight. That document still exists. It is preserved in the collections of the Chicago History Museum, a piece of paper signed by the first president and the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, certifying that a Vermont farmer had invented a better way to make potash. This is where the story begins. The system established by the Patent Act of 1790 was almost immediately recognized as inadequate for the scale of applications that began arriving. The 3-person review board had not anticipated the volume of interest. The Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, and the Attorney General were among the busiest people in the new federal government. They had wars to manage and foreign policy to conduct, and legal questions of considerable complexity to address. Reviewing patent applications, however important in principle, was not always compatible with everything else they had to do. By 1793, Congress had passed a new Patent Act that significantly changed how the system worked. The 1793 Act removed the substantive review requirement. Under the new system, patents would be granted to essentially anyone who submitted an application in the proper form and paid the required fee. The question of whether an invention was genuinely new and genuinely useful would be left to the courts to decide if someone challenged a patent after it had been granted. This was a reasonable response to an administrative problem, but it created a different kind of problem. Under the registration system established by the 1793 Act, patents became easier to obtain but less reliable as legal documents. If anyone could get a patent simply by filing the right forms, then having a patent did not really prove much. It certainly did not prove that your invention was actually new or actually worked. It just proved that you had submitted the paperwork. The number of patents granted under the new system grew rapidly, and so did the number of patents that turned out, upon examination in court, to be invalid. The situation was, from the perspective of serious inventors who needed reliable legal protection for real work, increasingly unsatisfactory.
The tension between the desire for an accessible system and the need for a rigorous one would take another 4 decades to resolve. But in the meantime, something else was happening. The inventions themselves were getting more interesting. The 1790s and the early 1800s were not years of dramatic technological transformation in the United States. The country was still primarily agricultural. Its manufacturing sector was modest. Its transportation infrastructure was limited to roads and rivers, and in a few places, rudimentary canals. But the patents of this period, modest as most of them were, reveal something important about the texture of American economic life and the problems that American inventors were trying to solve. The overwhelming majority of early American patents were for improvements to existing agricultural and manufacturing processes. Better ways to card wool, better ways to mill grain, better ways to cure leather, better ways to construct wheels and axles and the other components of the horse-drawn vehicles that were the primary form of land transportation. These were not glamorous inventions. They were not the kind of thing that gets written about in history books or celebrated in museums. They were practical solutions to practical problems of people who worked with their hands and needed their tools and processes to work better than they currently did. But they were inventions nonetheless. Someone had thought carefully about a problem, had tried different approaches, had arrived at a solution that was genuinely better than what had come before, and they had taken the trouble to file a patent, which means they believed their improvement had enough value to be worth protecting. That belief, repeated 10 million times over 2 centuries, is the subject of this history.
There is a fire that most people have never heard of, and it changed everything. On the night of December 15, 1836, a fire broke out in the building that housed the United States Patent Office in Washington, D.C. The building, which the Patent Office shared with the Post Office, was consumed almost entirely. The flames moved quickly through the wooden interior, through the storerooms and the filing cabinets, and the shelves of bound records that had been accumulating since 1790. By the time the fire was extinguished, nearly the entire archive of the American patent system had been destroyed. Roughly 10,000 patent records, 46 years of accumulated documentation of American invention were gone. The models that inventors had been required to submit along with their applications, physical 3-dimensional objects representing the devices they had created, most of those were gone as well. It was, by any measure, a catastrophic loss. But the fire of 1836 did not only destroy something, it also created something. Because in the aftermath of that fire, Congress was forced to rebuild the patent system from the ground up. And in rebuilding it, they had the opportunity to fix the problems that had been accumulating since 1793. The Patent Act of 1836 is, among historians of intellectual property law, generally regarded as the most important piece of patent legislation in American history, more important than the original 1790 Act that created the system, more important than the various amendments and revisions that came later. Because the 1836 Act established the basic architecture of the patent examination system that, in its essential form, still exists today. The key change was the reintroduction of substantive examination. Under the 1793 system, remember, patents were granted to anyone who filed the proper forms and paid the fee. The 1836 Act changed that. Under the new system, every patent application would be reviewed by a trained examiner whose specific job was to determine whether the claimed invention was genuinely new and genuinely useful. If the examiner found that the invention had already been described or patented elsewhere, the application would be rejected. If the examiner found that the claimed invention did not actually work as described, the application would be rejected. This sounds like an obvious improvement, and it was, but it required something that the United States government had not previously possessed in this context: a professional class of technically trained reviewers with access to a comprehensive library of existing patents and scientific literature, capable of making informed judgments about the state of knowledge in dozens of different fields simultaneously. The 1836 Act created the Commissioner of Patents as a senior federal official responsible for overseeing this system. It established a structured organization of patent examiners. It mandated the creation of a library that would contain not only American patents, but foreign patents and scientific publications from around the world. Henry Leavitt Ellsworth became the first Commissioner of Patents under the new system. He was a man of considerable organizational energy and genuine enthusiasm for the institution he had been asked to build. He understood that what he was constructing was not simply an administrative office, but something closer to a national repository of technical knowledge. Every patent application that came through his office contained a description of how something worked. Over time, those descriptions would accumulate into an archive of extraordinary depth and detail. Ellsworth was the person who first articulated, clearly and in writing, the idea that the Patent Office was not merely a regulatory body, but an intellectual institution, a place where the sum of American inventive knowledge was gathered and organized and made available. He took seriously the requirement to rebuild the archive that the fire had destroyed, and he organized one of the first systematic efforts in American history to track down copies of patents that had been granted before the fire, to correspond with inventors and their heirs, and request duplicates of documents that might have survived in private hands. Not everything was recovered. Many of the earliest patents are known to us today only through indirect references in other documents, through mentions in newspapers or legal records or personal correspondence. The fire created a gap in the historical record that has never been fully repaired. But the effort to repair it and the institutional infrastructure built to support that effort gave the Patent Office a self-consciousness about its own history that it has maintained ever since. Now, before we continue into the remarkable decades that followed, this feels like the right moment to ask something of you. If you are still here, listening to the history of an institution that most people have never thought carefully about, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Subscribing takes about 3 seconds. It keeps content like this coming. And if the slow, careful pace of this kind of history is what you need at the end of a long day, please do subscribe now. It means more than you might think. The 1836 Act also established something called the interference proceeding, which became one of the most distinctive and in many ways most contentious features of the American patent system.
An interference proceeding was a formal process by which two inventors who had applied for patents on the same or similar inventions could have their competing claims adjudicated by the Patent Office itself. The question to be decided was one of priority. Who had invented the claimed device or process first? The American patent system, unlike the systems that developed in most other countries, operated on what was called the first to invent principle. The person who deserved the patent was not necessarily the person who filed the application first. It was the person who had actually conceived of the invention first and had diligently worked to reduce it to practice. This sounds like a fair principle, and in many individual cases it produced fair results, but it also created enormous complexity. Determining who had invented something first required examining diaries, notebooks, correspondence, the testimony of witnesses, and physical evidence of the kind that inventors were not always careful to preserve. It created incentives for record-keeping that were sometimes genuine and sometimes manufactured after the fact for litigation purposes. It produced disputes that dragged on for years and consumed resources that might otherwise have been spent on further invention. The interference system would remain a feature of American patent law until 2013, when the America Invents Act finally shifted the United States to a first-to-file system, more consistent with international practice. But during the century and 3/4 of its existence, it generated some of the most dramatic and consequential patent disputes in American history.
The dispute over the telephone is among the most famous. Alexander Graham Bell filed his application for a patent on the telephone on February 14, 1876. On the very same day, a few hours later, an inventor named Elisha Gray filed a document called a caveat, which was a preliminary notice of intention to file a patent application, covering a device that bore significant similarities to what Bell had described. The question of whether Bell or Gray had the stronger claim to priority over the telephone became the subject of legal proceedings that lasted for years. The Patent Office ultimately ruled in Bell's favor, a decision that Bell's critics at the time and some historians since have found questionable. But the telephone dispute, as dramatic as it was only one of many interference proceedings that shaped the history of American technology. There were disputes over the electric light, over the radio, over the airplane, over the integrated circuit. Each of these disputes involved real questions about who had done what and when, and whether the people who ultimately received the patents were truly the ones who deserved them. The interference system made the Patent Office something more than an administrative filing bureau. It made it an adjudicatory body, a place where the ownership of ideas was actually contested and decided. And that gave it a kind of power and significance that extended far beyond its original administrative function. In the years following the 1836 Act, the volume of patent applications began to grow in ways that even the most optimistic supporters of the system had not fully anticipated. The reason was not simply that more people were inventing things, though that was certainly part of it. The reason was also that the 1836 system had made patents more valuable. A patent that had been rigorously examined and found to be genuinely new was a much more reliable legal instrument than a patent that had been granted simply because someone filed the forms correctly. Inventors and the businesses that backed them were more willing to invest in obtaining patents when they could be reasonably confident that those patents would hold up in court. And in the middle decades of the 19th century, something else was happening that would transform the relationship between the Patent Office and American society.
The Industrial Revolution was arriving. It had been underway in England for decades. The great textile mills of Lancashire, the iron foundries, the steam engines that drove an expanding network of mines and manufactories. These had been reshaping English economic life since the late 18th century. But the transition in the United States was slower and more uneven, shaped by the geography of a vast continent and the particular social and economic conditions of a young republic that was still, in many regions, primarily agricultural. But by the 1840s, it was unmistakable. The railroads were spreading across the eastern United States with a speed that astonished observers at the time, and still astonishes when you look at the maps. In 1830, there were roughly 23 miles of railroad track in the entire country. By 1850, there were more than 9,000. By 1860, more than 30,000. That expansion required invention. It required better steam engines and better rails and better braking systems and better signaling methods and better ways to bridge rivers and cut through hills. And each of those improvements, if genuinely new and genuinely useful, made its way through the Patent Office in Washington. The patent records of the 1840s and 1850s are, in this sense, a detailed technical history of how the railroad was built. They contain thousands of small improvements, most of them forgotten now, that collectively made long-distance rail travel possible, and then practical, and then routine. This pattern, the accumulation of small improvements that together constitute a transformation, is one of the most important things the patent record reveals about how technology actually develops. We tend to remember the dramatic moments, the first locomotive, the first telegraph message, the first powered flight. But behind each of those moments, there are hundreds or thousands of incremental improvements,
each one protected by a patent, each one contributing something modest to a larger development that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. The Patent Office, because it was required by law to examine each application on its own terms and to document each granted patent in detail, created the only comprehensive record we have of how that accumulation actually worked. It is an archive not of genius, but of effort, of the slow, difficult, frequently unsuccessful work of trying to make things better. And it is to that archive and to the extraordinary decades that lay ahead of it that we will turn in the next part of this history.
There's a word that Americans invented, more or less, and that word is tinkerer. Not in the sense that the word did not exist before, but in the sense that the particular cultural figure it describes, the self-taught, workshop-dwelling, endlessly curious individual who takes things apart to see how they work and puts them back together in ways that work better. That figure became, in the middle decades of the 19th century, something close to a national archetype in the United States. Other countries had inventors. England had produced James Watt and George Stephenson and a long list of engineers and scientists whose work had transformed the material conditions of modern life. France had its own tradition of technical education and systematic invention. Germany was developing the university-based research institutions that would eventually make it the dominant scientific power of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But the American inventor was understood, at least in the popular imagination of the time, as something distinct from all of these. The American inventor did not necessarily have a university education. He did not work in a government laboratory or under the patronage of a wealthy aristocrat. He worked in a barn or a basement or a rented room with tools he had purchased himself or built himself, on problems he had identified himself, motivated by a combination of genuine curiosity and the very practical hope that if he solved the problem, the Patent Office's trained examiners found genuinely new. The democratization of invention, the idea that anyone with a good idea and the energy to develop it could participate in the patent system, was not just a rhetorical flourish. It was, in significant measure, real. And it was one of the things that made the American patent system different in character, if not always in formal legal structure, from the patent systems of other industrializing nations. The numbers tell part of the story. In 1840, the Patent Office granted 473 patents. In 1850, it granted 995. In 1860, it granted 4,738. In 1870, the number had risen to 12,157. In 1880, it was 13,947. That trajectory, that sustained and accelerating growth across 4 decades, reflects something real about what was happening in American economic and technological life. The country was industrializing rapidly. The problems that industrialization created and the opportunities it opened were generating invention at a pace that the founders of the patent system could not possibly have imagined. And the Patent Office was growing to meet that demand. By the 1850s, the organization that Henry Leavitt Ellsworth had begun to build in the aftermath of the 1836 fire had become a substantial federal institution. It employed dozens of examiners, each specializing in a particular area of technology. It maintained an extensive library of domestic and foreign patents and technical publications. It occupied an increasingly grand building in Washington, a building whose construction had begun in the 1830s and would continue for decades, eventually producing one of the most architecturally significant federal buildings of the 19th century. The Patent Office Building, now known as the Old Patent Office Building and home to the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the National Portrait Gallery, was designed in the Greek Revival style and constructed of white marble. Its Great Hall, the Model Hall, was lined on both sides with glass cases containing the physical models that inventors were required to submit with their applications until 1880. Those models were, by all accounts, extraordinary to behold.
Visitors to Washington in the mid-19th century frequently listed the Patent Office's Model Hall as among the most remarkable sights in the capital. Walt Whitman, who worked as a volunteer nurse in Washington during the Civil War and spent considerable time in the Patent Office building, which was used as a hospital during that period, wrote about the models with genuine wonder. He described walking through the Great Hall and seeing thousands of miniature machines and devices, each one representing someone's attempt to solve a problem or improve a process, arranged in cases that stretched the length of an enormous room. The models were not merely decorative, they served a genuine function in the examination process. An examiner who was uncertain about whether a claimed device would actually work as described could look at the model, could sometimes operate it, and make a more informed judgment than would have been possible from the written description and drawings alone. But the models were also something more than examination aids. They were a physical record of American inventive ambition accumulated over decades in a single room. Each one had a story. Each one represented a person who had spent time and money and thought on a problem and had believed enough to go through the formal process of applying for a patent that their solution was worth protecting. When the Patent Office stopped requiring models in 1880, partly because the volume of applications had grown to the point where storing them had become impractical, something was lost. The patent record became entirely textual and diagrammatic, which is more efficient and in many ways more useful, but it no longer had that immediate physical dimension. You could no longer walk into a room and see in 3 dimensions what American inventors had been doing for the past century. Now, if you have been listening to this history and finding that it carries you somewhere quiet and attentive, that is the purpose of this channel. And if you have not yet subscribed, this is a good moment to do that. The algorithm that determines who finds content like this responds to subscriptions and to likes, and every one of them genuinely helps. If this kind of slow, careful history is something you value, please take a moment to show that. It makes a real difference to whether this channel can keep making content like this. The middle decades of the 19th century also saw a phenomenon that the patent system's founders had not specifically anticipated, though in retrospect it seems almost inevitable.
The patent attorney. The process of obtaining a patent, even under the relatively streamlined system established by the 1836 Act, was not simple. An application required a written description of the invention, called the specification, that had to be precise enough to define the boundaries of the claimed invention, without being so narrow that competitors could easily design around it. It required drawings prepared according to specific technical standards. It required the identification and articulation of what were called claims, the specific assertions about what the inventor believed was new and what protection they were seeking. Getting these elements right required a combination of technical understanding and legal skill that most inventors did not possess. And so, fairly quickly after the 1836 system was established, a class of specialists emerged whose business was to help inventors navigate the application process. Some of these specialists were trained lawyers. Others were technically educated individuals with enough legal knowledge to prepare applications competently. They set up offices in Washington, close to the Patent Office, and they advertised their services in newspapers and trade publications. They developed expertise in particular technical fields and built relationships with the examiners who handled applications in those fields. The patent attorney became, over time, a central figure in the American innovation economy, not an inventor, but an essential enabler of invention, the person who translated the often imprecise and technically idiosyncratic descriptions that inventors provided into the precise legal language that the patent system required. This professionalization of the patent process had complicated effects. On one hand, it improved the quality of patent applications and reduced the number of applications that were rejected for purely technical reasons.
Inventors who worked with competent patent attorneys were more likely to receive patents that accurately described their inventions and that would hold up in court. On the other hand, it made the system somewhat less accessible to inventors who could not afford professional assistance. The democratic ideal of the patent system, the idea that anyone with a good idea could participate regardless of their resources, was complicated by the reality that navigating the system well required either legal skill or money to hire someone who had it.
This tension between accessibility and rigor, between the idealistic vision of open participation and the practical realities of a technically complex legal process, would continue to shape debates about patent policy for the next century and a half. But in the 1850s and 1860s, the most dramatic development in the history of the Patent Office was not about process or professionalization. It was about a single technology that was changing the world faster than almost any technology before it. The railroad had been the dominant technological story of the 1840s, but by the late 1850s, another technology was beginning to generate patent applications at a pace that reflected its extraordinary potential: the electric telegraph. Samuel Morse had received his patent for the electromagnetic telegraph in 1840. The famous demonstration of the system, the transmission of the message, "What hath God wrought?" from Washington to Baltimore in 1844, had established beyond any reasonable doubt that the technology worked and that its implications were enormous. Within a decade, telegraph lines were spreading across the eastern United States. Within 2 decades, a submarine cable had been laid across the Atlantic Ocean. The speed of communication had been transformed, not incrementally, but categorically. Messages that had previously taken days or weeks to travel between cities now traveled in seconds. And every aspect of the telegraph system, every component of the hardware, every technique for laying cables and operating equipment and improving signal quality was moving through the Patent Office in Washington. The telegraph patents of the 1850s and 1860s are a remarkable collection of documents. They reveal in granular technical detail how a fundamentally new form of communication technology was developed and refined by hundreds of inventors working on different pieces of the same general problem. Most of those inventors are unknown today. Their names appear in the patent records and nowhere else. They solved specific problems, narrow technical problems about insulation or relay design or the mechanics of the receiving apparatus, and they received patents for those solutions, and then they returned to their workshops and continued working. This is the reality of technological development that the patent record makes visible in a way that no other historical source quite does. Innovation is almost never the product of a single genius working in isolation. It's the product of dozens or hundreds of people working on related problems, each contributing something, most of them forgotten. The accumulation of their work eventually producing something that looks, from the outside and from a distance, like a sudden transformation. The patent record does not let you maintain that illusion. It shows you every step, every small improvement, every failed approach that someone nevertheless thought worth filing a patent on, every incremental advance that made the next advance possible. It is, in that sense, the most honest record we have of how human ingenuity actually works. And in the decades that were coming, the decades of Edison and Bell, and the extraordinary technological upheaval of the late 19th century, that record would become more dense and more revealing than anything that had come before it. That is where we are headed next. There is a building in Menlo Park, New Jersey that no longer exists, and it may have been the most important building in the history of American invention. It was not a grand building. It was not particularly large, By the standards of the industrial facilities that were beginning to appear across the northeastern United States in the 1870s, it was modest almost to the point of insignificance. A two-story wooden structure, roughly 100 feet long and 30 feet wide, set on a slight rise in the New Jersey countryside, about 25 miles from New York City. Thomas Edison built it in 1876. He was 29 years old. What Edison built at Menlo Park was not simply a laboratory in the conventional sense of that word. It was something that had not quite existed before in the United States, and perhaps not anywhere in the world in quite the same form. It was an invention factory, a place staffed by machinists and chemists and electricians and draftsmen whose collective purpose was the systematic production of patentable innovations. Edison himself described his intention with characteristic directness. He said he wanted to produce a minor invention every 10 days and a big thing every 6 months or so. He came remarkably close to achieving that goal. Between 1876 and 1882, the Menlo Park Laboratory produced an extraordinary series of inventions: the phonograph in 1877, the carbon microphone that made the telephone practically useful, also in 1877, the incandescent light bulb in 1879, the electrical distribution system that made the light bulb commercially viable in 1882, and alongside these landmark achievements, hundreds of smaller inventions, improvements to telegraph equipment, advances in electrical measurement, refinements to the systems that supported and enabled the larger breakthroughs. By the time Edison moved his operations to a larger facility in West Orange, New Jersey, in 1887, he had accumulated more than 400 patents from the Menlo Park years alone. Over the course of his entire career, he would be granted 1,093 patents by the United States Patent Office, a record that stood for many decades and that still represents one of the most remarkable accumulations of patent grants in American history. But the significance of Edison's relationship with the Patent Office was not simply quantitative, it was structural. Edison understood, with a clarity that few inventors of his generation matched, that the patent was not the end of the inventive process, it was a strategic instrument, a tool for controlling a market, for establishing and defending a competitive position, for generating the revenue that funded further invention. He did not patent things because he wanted a certificate on his wall. He patented things because patents were weapons in the competitive battles that determined who profited from new technology and who did not. This understanding shaped how he approached invention itself. When Edison and his team began working on the incandescent light system, they did not simply try to create a working light bulb. They tried to create a working light bulb and file patents on every component of the system, every manufacturing process, every technical improvement, in a way that would make it as difficult as possible for competitors to enter the market without infringing on Edison's intellectual property. This strategy was not unique to Edison, but he pursued it with greater systematism and greater resources than almost anyone else of his time. And the result was a series of patent battles that reshaped the American electrical industry and that kept the courts and the patent office occupied for decades. The most consequential of these battles involved a young Serbian engineer named Nikola Tesla, a Croatian-born inventor named George Westinghouse, and a dispute over whether electrical power should be distributed as direct current, which Edison's system used, or alternating current, which Tesla and Westinghouse championed. The technical details of that dispute are well documented elsewhere. What is relevant here is the role that patents played in it. Edison held extensive patents on direct current distribution systems and the equipment associated with them.
The ability to manufacture and sell electrical equipment without infringing on them required either licensing them, which Edison could refuse, or developing alternative technical approaches that fell outside their scope.
The patent system, in other words, was not merely recording the history of American electrical technology in this period. It was actively shaping it. The boundaries that Edison's patents drew around direct current technology were among the forces that pushed Tesla and Westinghouse toward developing alternating current systems as thoroughly and as aggressively as they did. The war of currents, as it came to be known, was fought partly in the marketplace, partly in the press, and partly in the patent office and the courts. And it was ultimately decided not by patents alone, but by the physics of electricity and the economics of long-distance power transmission, which favored alternating current regardless of who held what patents. But the conflict illustrated something important about what the patent system had become by the 1880s. It had become a central arena of American industrial competition, not a peripheral legal formality, but a strategic battleground where the future of entire industries was contested. And the Patent Office, which was processing thousands of applications every year and adjudicating interference proceedings that sometimes involved the most powerful industrial interests in the country, had become one of the most consequential institutions in the American economy. Before we continue into the remarkable complexity of what came next, take a moment if you would. If you have been following this history through multiple parts now, and if the slow accumulation of detail is giving you a picture of something you had not previously understood, that is what this channel is built to do. A like on this video helps other people find it. It is a small thing that makes a genuine difference. Please do that now if this history has been worth your time. The telephone patents offer another window into the patent battles of the Gilded Age, and they are worth examining in some detail because the disputes they generated were among the most legally complex and historically significant in the 19th century. Alexander Graham Bell's patent for the telephone, granted on March 7, 1876, is one of the most valuable patents in American history. The Bell Telephone Company, which was formed to exploit that patent and the related patents that Bell and his associates accumulated, became within a few years one of the most profitable and most powerful corporations in the United States. The value of the telephone patent depended entirely on its validity and its scope. If Bell had truly been the first to invent the telephone, and if his patent claims were interpreted broadly enough to cover the technology as it was actually used commercially, then Bell Telephone had something close to a legal monopoly on one of the most transformative technologies of the age. Both of those conditions were contested vigorously and persistently for more than a decade. The challenge from Elisha Gray, whose caveat had been filed on the same day as Bell's patent application, was only the first and most famous of the legal challenges that Bell Telephone faced. There were others. Some of them raised genuinely serious questions about the scope of Bell's claims and about whether certain uses of telephone technology fell within his patents or outside them. The Patent Office and the federal courts worked through these challenges over many years. Bell Telephone ultimately prevailed in the most important of them, retaining the core patents that gave it its dominant market position until those patents began to expire in the late 1880s. But the process of defending those patents was itself enormously consequential. Bell Telephone fought hundreds of patent infringement cases during the period of its patent monopoly. It employed teams of lawyers who did nothing but patent litigation. It developed, out of necessity, a level of sophistication about patent strategy and patent litigation that no other American corporation had previously needed to develop. That sophistication did not disappear when the telephone patents expired. It became part of the institutional knowledge of what eventually became the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, AT&T, and it shaped how that company thought about intellectual property and competitive strategy for generations.
The Gilded Age patent battles were not only about electricity and the telephone. They touched virtually every significant technology of the period. The sewing machine industry had been transformed in the 1850s by what became known as the sewing machine combination, a patent pool in which the major manufacturers of sewing machines agreed to share their patents with each other and to collectively license them to competitors rather than fighting endless infringement suits. It was one of the first significant patent pools in American history, and it established a model that would be used in other industries for the next century. The reaper and thresher industries, which were transforming American agriculture, were similarly shaped by patent disputes. Cyrus McCormick's patents on the mechanical reaper were among the most fought-over patents of the mid-19th century. The legal battles over those patents helped define the boundaries of the agricultural machinery industry and determined which companies could compete in it and on what terms.
The rubber industry, the oil industry, the steel industry. Each of these had its own patent disputes, its own interference proceedings, its own battles over who had invented what and who had the right to profit from it. The patent office was at the center of all of it. Not always visibly, not always in ways that made newspaper headlines, but consistently and consequentially shaping the competitive landscape of the American economy through the decisions it made about what to patent and how broadly to interpret the claims of the patents it granted. The examiners who worked in the patent office during this period were, in a real sense, among the most important economic policymakers in the country. The judgments they made about whether a claimed invention was genuinely new, about whether it fell within the scope of an existing patent or outside it, had consequences that rippled through industries and affected the livelihoods of thousands of people. Most of those examiners are completely unknown today. They left no memoirs, they gave no speeches. Their names appear in the administrative records of the Patent Office and in the legal documents associated with the cases they worked on, and nowhere else. But the work they did, day after day, in the examination rooms of that great marble building in Washington, was among the most consequential, quiet work of the Gilded Age. As the 19th century moved into its final decade, the pace of technological change was accelerating in ways that even the most forward-looking observers found difficult to fully comprehend. The electrical systems that Edison and Tesla and Westinghouse had pioneered were spreading across American cities. The internal combustion engine, which would transform transportation in the 20th century, was beginning to appear in the patent record. The chemical industry was developing new processes and new materials at a rate that kept patent office examiners in constant motion. And in a bicycle workshop in Dayton, Ohio, two brothers named Wilbur and Orville Wright were beginning to think carefully about a problem that many people considered unsolvable. The history of what happened next and what the patent record reveals about it is among the most instructive and, in some ways, most troubling chapters in the entire story of American intellectual property. That chapter begins in the next part of this history. There is a photograph taken on the morning of December 17, 1903, at a place called Kill Devil Hills on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and it shows something that had never happened before in the history of the world. A heavier-than-air machine, powered by a gasoline engine, is visible a few feet above the ground. One man is lying flat on the lower wing operating the controls. Another man is standing to the side, having just released his grip on the wingtip where he had been steadying the machine at the start of its run. The sky behind them is gray and cold. The sand is flat and featureless. The flight lasted 12 seconds. The machine traveled 120 feet. By the standards of what aviation would become within a generation, it was almost nothing, a 12-second hop above a beach. But it was also, unambiguously and permanently, the first time a heavier-than-air aircraft had lifted from the ground, flown under control, and landed at a point no lower than its starting point. Wilbur and Orville Wright
had solved the problem of flight. And within weeks of that December morning, they had begun the process of protecting their solution with patents. The Wright brothers' approach to the patent system was shaped by their understanding of what they had actually invented. They were careful, methodical thinkers, trained by years of self-directed study and practical experimentation to be precise about what they knew and what they did not know. And what they believed they had invented was not simply a flying machine. They believed they had invented the fundamental method by which a heavier-than-air aircraft could be controlled in flight. The key insight was what they called wing warping, the ability to control an aircraft's roll, its tendency to tip from side to side by slightly twisting the trailing edges of the wings in opposite directions. This gave the pilot control over the lateral balance of the aircraft in a way that earlier experimenters had not achieved. Their patent application, filed in March of 1903, before the successful flight at Kill Devil Hills, described this system of control in terms that were deliberately broad. They were not patenting a specific aircraft design. They were patenting the principle of using movable surfaces to control an aircraft's lateral balance. The specific mechanism, whether wing warping or the hinged ailerons that other designers were independently developing, was, in their view, covered by their claims. The patent was granted on May 22, 1906, United States Patent number 821393.
It is one of the most consequential and most controversial patents in American history. For the first several years after the Kitty Hawk flights, the Wright brothers were not primarily focused on the patent as a commercial weapon. They were focused on developing their aircraft into something genuinely practical and trying to sell it, first to the United States Army and then to other potential buyers. Those efforts were slow and frustrating. The Army was skeptical. European governments were more interested, but the negotiations were complicated. The brothers spent years flying in private, demonstrating their aircraft only under carefully controlled conditions, unwilling to give public demonstrations that might allow competitors to study their methods before they had secured adequate patent protection. This caution was understandable from a competitive standpoint, but it had a cost. While the Wrights were protecting their secrets, other inventors in the United States and Europe were working on the same problems, approaching them from different directions and making their own progress. The most important of these competitors, from the perspective of the patent battles that followed, was Glenn Curtiss. Curtiss was a motorcycle manufacturer and racing enthusiast from Hammondsport, New York, who had become interested in aviation through his work building lightweight engines. He was a gifted engineer and an accomplished pilot, and by 1908 he was building and flying aircraft that were in many respects as capable as the Wrights' machines. The Wright brothers sued Curtiss for patent infringement in 1909. The core of the legal dispute was whether the aileron control systems that Curtiss used in his aircraft fell within the scope of the Wright patent. Curtiss argued that ailerons, which were separate movable surfaces attached between the wings, were technically distinct from the wing warping system that the Wrights had patented. The Wrights argued that their patent covered any system of movable surfaces used to achieve lateral control. Regardless of the specific mechanical implementation, this was exactly the kind of claim scope dispute that patent litigation has always turned on. The words of a patent claim can be written broadly or narrowly, and the courts must decide, in any given case of alleged infringement, whether the accused device falls within the scope of the claim as properly interpreted. The legal proceedings that followed the Wright brothers' lawsuit against Curtiss lasted for years. They were expensive, contentious, and absorbing of the time and energy of some of the most talented aviation engineers in the country. While lawyers argued about claim scope in federal courtrooms, the practical development of American aviation slowed. This is one of the most discussed and most troubling episodes in the history of the American patent system, The argument that the Wright patent litigation retarded the development of American aviation, that it kept talented engineers tied up in legal disputes rather than building better aircraft, has been made by historians repeatedly and with considerable supporting evidence. By the time the United States entered the First World War in 1917, American aviation was in some respects behind the European powers, particularly France and Germany, that had not been subject to the same patent warfare. The United States government, recognizing that the patent dispute was a national security problem, essentially forced a resolution. The major aircraft manufacturers were required to form a patent pool, sharing their patents with each other and paying a fixed licensing fee, rather than fighting individual infringement suits. The cross-licensing agreement that emerged from this government intervention was called the Manufacturers Aircraft Association. It resolved the immediate legal conflicts and allowed American aircraft production to proceed at the scale that the war demanded. But the episode left a complicated legacy. On one hand, it demonstrated that the patent system could be used to slow as well as accelerate technological development. A sufficiently broad patent, aggressively enforced, could create a bottleneck through which all development in a field had to pass, and the holder of that patent could use that position to extract licensing fees, to exclude competitors, or simply to slow the pace of change in ways that served their interests, regardless of the broader social cost. On the other hand, the Wright brothers had done something genuinely extraordinary. They had solved a problem that had defeated every previous attempt. They had invested years of their own time and money and thought. The patent system existed precisely to protect people like them, to ensure that inventors who made fundamental breakthroughs could profit from those breakthroughs, rather than watching competitors immediately copy their work. The tension between these two legitimate considerations, protecting inventors and preventing patent holders from monopolizing entire fields of technology, is one that the patent system has never fully resolved. It was present in the Wright case in an unusually clear and dramatic form, but it appears in some version in almost every significant patent dispute in American history.
If you have found this history worth following across 5 parts now, and if the complexity of these questions is giving you a more textured understanding of how American technology and American law have shaped each other, please take a moment to like this video. It is the clearest signal you can send that this kind of careful, unhurried history is worth making. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please do that as well. It keeps this work possible. The Patent Office itself, during the years of the Wright-Curtis dispute, was continuing to process applications at a rate that reflected the extraordinary pace of technological change in the early 20th century. The automobile was generating patent applications by the thousands. Every component of the internal combustion engine, every aspect of the transmission and steering systems that made automobiles practical, was moving through the examination rooms in Washington. Henry Ford's assembly line methods, which transformed not just automobile manufacturing, but the entire concept of industrial production, were protected by patents. The suppliers and competitors who sought to enter the automobile market had to navigate a dense thicket of existing patents held by Ford and by General Motors and by the dozens of smaller manufacturers who had accumulated intellectual property in the years before Ford's dominance became complete. The chemical industry was similarly dense with patent activity. The synthetic dye industry, which had been pioneered in Germany and which American manufacturers were trying to develop domestically, was an area of intense patent competition. The pharmaceutical industry, still in its early stages by modern standards, was beginning to file patents on the synthesis processes for new drugs. The rubber industry, the glass industry, the petroleum refining industry, each had its own complex patent landscape that shaped competitive dynamics in ways that were sometimes visible to the public and sometimes entirely hidden within the technical language of patent specifications. The early 20th century also saw the emergence of a new kind of patent holder that would eventually transform the relationship between invention and industry: the corporate research laboratory.
General Electric had established a research laboratory in Schenectady, New York in 1900. AT&T established its research organization, which would eventually become Bell Laboratories, in the years following the expiration of the original telephone patents. DuPont, Eastman Kodak, and other large industrial corporations followed with their own research facilities in the first 2 decades of the century. These laboratories were different in character from Edison's invention factory at Menlo Park, though Edison's model had inspired them. They were staffed by professionally trained scientists and engineers, many of them with advanced university degrees, working on research programs defined by corporate strategy rather than individual curiosity. And they filed patents systematically, comprehensively, and strategically, in ways that individual inventors rarely could. A corporate research laboratory working on a new technology did not simply file a patent when it had a working invention. It filed patents on every approach it explored, every component it developed, every process it refined, building a portfolio of intellectual property that surrounded the core technology and made it as difficult as possible for competitors to develop alternatives without infringing on something. This approach to patent strategy, which became standard practice among large industrial corporations in the early 20th century, transformed the character of the patent system in ways that would generate controversy and policy debate for the rest of the century. The individual inventor, the tinkerer in the barn who had been the romantic hero of the 19th century patent system, was not disappearing, but he was being joined, and in terms of sheer volume of patent filings, increasingly overshadowed by organizations with resources and strategic sophistication that no individual could match. What that transformation meant for the American innovation economy and how the Patent Office adapted to it is the story that the next part of this history will take up. The 20th century, with all of its extraordinary technological upheaval, was just beginning.
There is a number that we began this history with, and it is worth returning to it now. 10 million. 10 million patents granted by the United States Patent and Trademark Office since that spring day in 1790, when George Washington signed a document certifying that a Vermont farmer named Samuel Hopkins had invented a better way to make potash. 10 million moments of someone saying, "I thought of something new," and the government of the United States saying, "Yes, and here is the proof." We have traveled a long way through this history. We have watched a 3-person review board consisting of the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, and the Attorney General give way to a professional examination system. We have seen the fire of 1836 destroy 46 years of records and force the reconstruction of an institution from the ground up. We have walked through the model hall of the old Patent Office building and seen thousands of miniature machines and glass cases, each one representing a human being's attempt to solve a problem. We have watched Edison systematically weaponize the patent system in the service of industrial competition. And we have watched the Wright brothers use a single foundational patent to reshape the entire trajectory of American aviation. Now we come to the 20th century in full, and to the transformation that no one in 1790 and arguably no one in 1890 could have anticipated. The transformation of invention itself. The corporate research laboratory, which we began to examine in the previous part of this history, did not simply change who was filing patents, it changed what was being patented and why, and with what strategic intention. By the 1920s and 1930s, the major American industrial corporations had built research organizations of considerable sophistication. Bell Laboratories, which formally came into existence in 1925 as a subsidiary of AT&T, was by any measure the most remarkable of them. It employed physicists and chemists and engineers of the highest caliber, gave them resources that university laboratories could rarely match, and set them to work on fundamental scientific importance, alongside problems of immediate commercial relevance. The patents that came out of Bell Laboratories during its peak decades read like a compressed history of 20th century technology.
The transistor, invented at Bell Labs in 1947 by William Shockley, John Bardeen, and Walter Brattain, is perhaps the most consequential single invention of the 20th century. The transistor made possible everything that followed in electronics, from the integrated circuit to the microprocessor to the personal computer to the smartphone that many of you are perhaps listening to this history on right now.
The patent for the transistor, United States Patent number 2524035, was granted in 1950. It described a device for amplifying electrical signals using a semiconductor material. The language of the patent specification was precise and technical and gave very little indication of the scale of what it was describing. But what it was describing was the foundation of the modern world. Bell Laboratories filed patents on the transistor and on the semiconductor technology surrounding it, and then, in a decision shaped partly by antitrust concerns and partly by strategic calculation, AT&T licensed the transistor patents broadly and at relatively low cost to other manufacturers. That licensing decision, which allowed companies across the United States and Japan and eventually the world to build on transistor technology without prohibitive licensing fees, is one of the reasons the electronics revolution of the second half of the 20th century happened as quickly and as broadly as it did. It was, in its way, a demonstration that patent holders have choices about how they use their intellectual property, and that those choices have consequences far beyond the immediate commercial interests of the patent holder. The contrast with the Wright brothers' approach to their aviation patents, made only 4 decades earlier, could not have been more instructive. The decades of the 1950s and 1960s brought a new wave of fundamental technologies into the patent system, each one generating its own complex landscape of intellectual property disputes and strategic maneuvering. The integrated circuit, which placed multiple transistors and other electronic components on a single piece of semiconductor material, was invented essentially simultaneously and independently by Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments and Robert Noyce at Fairchild Semiconductor in 1958 and 1959. The resulting patent dispute between Texas Instruments and Fairchild was resolved through cross-licensing, a solution that by this point had become a standard tool for managing conflicts between major patent holders in the same technological space. The laser, the chemical processes underlying the modern pharmaceutical industry, the satellite communication systems that began to transform global telecommunications in the 1960s, each of these generated patent portfolios of enormous complexity and strategic importance. And the Patent Office, which had been processing thousands of applications per year in the early 20th century, was now processing tens of thousands. The professional staff of examiners, each specializing in a technical field, had grown into a large federal bureaucracy. The library of prior art that examiners consulted had expanded to encompass not just patents, but the entire published literature of science and engineering in dozens of languages. The examination process was more rigorous and more technically sophisticated than anything Henry Leavitt Ellsworth had imagined when he began rebuilding the Patent Office after the fire of 1836. But the fundamental principles were the same. Is this invention genuinely new? Is it genuinely useful? Does it represent a non-obvious advance over what was already known? Those 3 questions, novelty, utility, and non-obviousness, had been the core of the examination standard since the Patent Act of 1952 codified them explicitly. And they remain the core today.
The non-obviousness requirement deserves a moment of attention because it is in some ways the most intellectually interesting of the 3 standards and the one that generates the most difficult judgment calls.
An invention is non-obvious under the legal standard if it would not have been obvious to a person of ordinary skill in the relevant technical field at the time the invention was made. This standard attempts to ensure that patents are granted only for genuine advances, not for trivial combinations of existing knowledge that any competent practitioner in the field would have thought of without any special creative effort. In practice, determining what a hypothetical person of ordinary skill would have found obvious at a particular moment in time is genuinely difficult. It requires the examiner to reconstruct the state of knowledge in a technical field at a specific historical moment, to assess what was known and what was not known, and to make a judgment about whether the step from the known to the claimed invention required the kind of creative insight that the patent system is meant to reward. These judgments are inevitably somewhat subjective, and they have been the subject of litigation and policy debate for as long as the non-obviousness standard has existed. The most important Supreme Court decision on the non-obviousness standard came in 1966 in a case called Graham versus John Deere Company. The court's opinion in that case established a framework for analyzing non-obviousness that patent examiners and courts have used ever since. It required consideration of the scope and content of the prior art, the differences between the prior art and the claimed invention, the level of ordinary skill in the field, and certain secondary considerations, such as commercial success and the failure of others to solve the same problem. Graham versus John Deere is the kind of legal decision that most people have never heard of, and that nevertheless shapes, in invisible but consequential ways, the everyday practice of one of the most important institutions in the American economy. Now, before we reach the final chapter of this history, something needs to be said directly to you. You have spent real time with this. You followed this history from Samuel Hopkins and his potash patent in 1790, all the way through Edison and the Wright brothers and the transistor and everything in between. That is not a small thing. Most people do not have the patience or the curiosity for this kind of deep, unhurried history. The fact that you are still here says something about you. This channel exists for exactly that kind of person. And it can only keep existing if the people who find value in it take 30 seconds to show that. If you have not yet subscribed, please do it right now, not later, now, because later almost never happens, and this is the kind of channel that disappears if the people who love it forget to tell the platform that they love it. Subscribe, and then, before you move on, please leave a like on this video. A like is the single most powerful signal you can send that this history was worth making. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to whether content like this continues to reach the people who need it.
Thank you. Now, the digital age. The arrival of software and the internet created a crisis in the American patent system unlike anything it had previously faced. Not a crisis of fire or war or administrative overwhelm, though all of those had come before. A crisis of category. The patent system had been designed from its inception to protect inventions, tangible physical things, machines and processes and compositions of matter. The philosophical foundation of patent protection rested on the idea that an inventor had created something new in the physical world, something that could be described precisely enough that others could understand exactly what was being claimed. Software was different. Software was, at its most fundamental level, a set of logical instructions, a mathematical description of a process. And for much of the 20th century, the Patent Office and the courts had taken the position that mathematical algorithms and abstract logical processes were not patentable subject matter because they were not the kind of physical inventions that the patent system was designed to protect. That position began to erode in the 1980s. A series of Supreme Court decisions, most importantly, Diamond versus Deere in 1981, established that software could be patentable when it was implemented as part of a process that produced a physical result. The court's reasoning was careful and its holding was narrow, but the practical effect over the following decade was dramatic. Patent applications for software-implemented inventions began arriving at the patent office in large numbers. Examiners trained in electrical engineering and computer science found themselves evaluating claims that described logical processes rather than physical mechanisms, that used language borrowed from computer science rather than from mechanical or electrical engineering, and that raised questions about patentable subject matter that the examination guidelines had not previously needed to address. The business method patent became, in the 1990s and 2000s, one of the most controversial categories in the history of American intellectual property. Amazon's one-click purchasing patent, which covered the process of completing an online purchase with a single mouse click, became a symbol of what critics argued was a system granting patents on ideas that were obvious, trivial, or insufficiently inventive to deserve protection. The debate over software patents and business method patents generated more public attention and more congressional activity than any patent policy question in decades. It exposed deep disagreements about what the patent system was for, who it served, and whether its application to new categories of invention was producing the innovation it was supposed to encourage, or instead creating a thicket of overlapping claims that hindered development rather than promoting it.
The patent troll problem, which became a major policy concern in the 2000s and 2010s, was closely related to these questions. Patent assertion entities, companies that acquired patents not to practice them, but to license them aggressively to operating businesses, became a significant feature of the patent landscape. Critics argued that these entities exploited the high cost of patent litigation to extract settlements from companies that had not actually infringed any legitimate intellectual property. Defenders argued that they were simply enforcing legal rights that the patent system had created. The America Invents Act of 2011, the most significant reform of the United States patent law since 1952, attempted to address some of these concerns. It shifted the United States from a first-to-invent to a first-to-file system, bringing American practice into alignment with the rest of the world. It created new administrative procedures for challenging the validity of granted patents without going through full federal court litigation. It attempted to clarify the standards for patentable subject matter in ways that would reduce the grant of patents on abstract ideas. Whether it succeeded in those goals remains, among patent scholars and practitioners, genuinely contested. The Patent Office today processes more than 600,000 applications per year. It employs more than 10,000 patent examiners. It maintains a searchable database of every patent granted since 1976 and a collection of earlier patents that extends back to the beginning of the system. The 10 millionth patent, granted in June of 2018 to an inventor working on coherent laser technology, was one of roughly 350,000 patents granted that year. In the time it took you to listen to this history, the Patent Office probably processed dozens of applications and granted several patents on inventions that most people will never hear of and that may, in ways that are impossible to predict, shape the technological landscape of the coming decades. That is what makes this institution, this quiet, careful, largely invisible institution, so important and so worth understanding. Every major technology that defines modern life passed through it. Every industry that employs millions of people was shaped by it. Every dispute about who owned what idea and who had the right to profit from innovation was, at some point, adjudicated within its walls or according to the standards it applied. The history of the United States Patent Office is not the history of heroes and villains. It is not a story of triumph or of failure. It is the history of a society's ongoing attempt to answer a genuinely difficult question. How do you reward the people who create new knowledge without allowing them to prevent others from building on that knowledge? The answer has never been perfect.
It has been contested and revised and debated in every generation since Thomas Jefferson sat in his office in 1790 and read Samuel Hopkins' description of a better way to make potash. But the attempt itself, the sustained, institutionalized, legally formalized attempt to take ideas seriously and to protect them as a matter of public policy, is one of the things that has made the United States, whatever its failures in other domains, one of the most inventive societies in human history. 10 million patents. 10 million ideas that someone believed were worth protecting. 10 million moments when the machinery of the Republic said, yes, this matters, this is yours, here is the document to prove it. That is the story of the United States Patent Office. And it is, in the end, the story of what a country believes about the value of human thought. This has been a long journey, and if you made it to the end, you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. Slow history told carefully for people who believe that understanding something deeply is worth the time it takes. If this history gave you something, please give something back. Subscribe to this channel right now if you have not already. It is the single most important thing you can do to keep content like this coming. And leave a like on this video before you close it. Not because it helps an algorithm, though it does, but because it is a way of saying that this kind of careful, unhurried, deeply researched history deserves to exist. That the stories worth telling are not always the loudest ones. That sometimes the most important history is the history of a quiet building in Washington, where people spent their working lives deciding which ideas were new enough to matter. Thank you for listening to the entire history of the United States Patent Office. Sleep well.